All right, everybody, welcome to a random improv or impromptu of it's not theological discussion. We had that yesterday with other people to be discussing things, but now we are live with something I decided to impromptu and really have been wanting to engage in some sort of debate or dialogue or discussion in general with someone who I have a good bit of respect for in terms of the Muslim community. There you usually have some of the people that I've encountered. For those that have been watching the channel, you're familiar with Marshall Mathers or Marshall Ayub, however he wants to go by, and some of the things that have been said there. But ever since I've come across a server that went by the name Turkestan, if I'm not mistaken with the particular name, and trust me, when I came across that name, I almost thought that this was like some kind of insult or parody of Muslims. But no, apparently it was a server that was by Asadullah Ali, and
Mhm.
there was some people in there. Emin being one of the people that I got to meet that was involved in that, and it was refreshing to see what let's just call the more intellectual side of Islam versus some of the other things that I've been used to seeing due to Google Hangouts and all those other things. So it's been a interesting thing here. So right now we have, you know, our Muslim friend here, Emin. Emin, just tell us a little bit about yourself for some of the audience that doesn't know about you.
Hey, yeah, it's a joy to be here. Hello, everyone from all of the communities that are watching this, the Muslims and the Christians here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace of God and blessings of God be upon all of you. I'm Emin. Some of you might be familiar with my work with Farid. We've been working on making reputations against Islamophobic content online. I haven't really been active on the YouTube scene in terms of like debating with members of other religious communities like the Christian community or Jewish or whatever community out there. I've been more focused on just countering this narrative of demonizing Muslims and stuff like that. Other than that, I'm just a student of Arabic from Bosnia, and my expertise is Arabic language, and I delve into certain, details when it comes to philosophy, and I'm still going through a lot when it comes to basics of logic, and I'm interested in theology and stuff like that. Christian Muslim dialogue is definitely something that's part of who I am, and yeah, inshallah, I'm looking forward to having this discussion with my friend RC apologist, and it's really a joy to be here. And there's not much I can say about myself, to be honest. I prefer not to speak about myself too much. But yeah.
Yeah, and well, thank you for that, man. And I think, and that's when I have known about Farid for quite some time. Like I didn't know him, and we've been having some back and forth lately, ourselves. Because I do remember, and it was funny enough when we started actually going back and forth in the DMs. He actually, you know, remembered me at some point because I'm talking about a while back you when you did the video on Daniel Brubaker, you actually used one of my
Mhm.
videos on your video on that, where I was reviewing the book. Um, and so it was an interesting conversation. It was an interesting dialogue that me and him have been having, and then likewise we get the same kind of thing, you and me. But the purpose I want to do with this discussion is for some of the people that are not familiar with Islam, that they could get a basic understanding of it. And then, of course, to avoid this being another thing where James White has the conversation with Yasser Qadi, and then just a bunch of random people try to assume that somehow it's some sort of ecumenical bridging together of Christianity and Islam, much like Rick Warren did with Chrislam. Don't ask; that's a long story. Um,
Yeah.
it's we're gonna at least offer a perspective of offering some criticisms, and at least to this benefit, it could be the issue of number one, sharpening skills in this regard. Number two, if there are Christians that want to know some arguments on against Muslims, then this could be some. As well as number three, then for the Muslims that are in the audience, Amin's responses could be something of how then to engage with this. Ultimately, this being one of those resources that shows how we can, number one, be a disagreement while being respectful, and then number two, while having these respectful disagreements, still able to be friends that engage in back and forths with each other, and are at least able to I don't know where Emin is, but I'm just saying because say this. So like if we were to meet in real life, I feel like we would get along pretty fine, and we would
Yeah, yeah,
chill and hang
definitely,
out.
definitely. We'd have a nice cup of coffee, without a doubt.
Yeah, good old. I
Yeah,
I drink G Fuel or tea when I get my energy, but I understand where you're coming from.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you'd experience a whole different world if you came over here to Bosnia or something.
Oh,
Because our
Bosnia.
country is special, man. Yeah, I mean, you should visit. Really, I mean, I'd like to see the United States at least once in my life. It'd be
Oh
nice to
yeah,
see some of my friends over there.
yeah.
But yeah, so how did you want to go about this? Like, where do we
Well,
begin?
let's do this then. Let's start off with the basic of what is Islam in a brief general sense. What is Islam compared to like the other religions? Like what is Islam? What makes it stand out from the others?
What makes it stand out from the others? Well,
Hmm.
okay, so when speaking about a religion, we should obviously define it shortly,
Hmm.
as briefly as possible. When we use terms in the Arabic language and usually in theology, in Islamic theology, we have a division of linguistic meaning and terminological meaning, right? What is called in Arabic lughawi and istilahi, right? And this is
Hmm.
very important. So when it comes to defining what Islam is, right, there's two views, as in every other word that pertains to Islamic truths as we deem them to be true. So we would say that Islam, in its linguistic meaning, simply means the act of submission to God, the state of submission to the one God who is the eternal creator of the heavens and the earth, right? The glorious one, Lord, to whom there's no other God. When it comes to the terminological meaning, it is more about affirming both the oneness of God, which is the first testimony of faith, that there is no God except Allah. In Arabic, it is La ilaha illallah. And then it is the second testimony of faith, which is Muhammadun Rasulullah. Muhammad is the slave and messenger of Allah. It is essentially the religion of worshiping the one God and following the final prophet, Muhammad Sallallahu, who is the what we consider the final prophet and final messenger in a line and series of prophets that came to reveal God's books, that experience these manifestations of God's revelation through angels. So angels would appear to them, giving them the revelation of, for example, the Torah, the what we deem to be the Torah, the Injil or the Gospel, and the Quran. Mind you, when I say gospel here, I'm talking about the Muslim view of the gospel, which is that it's a revealed text and not really a historical documentation, as maybe some Christians might view it as,
Hmm.
or an inspired piece of literature. So Islam basically has four dimensions, right? And I'll talk about how this makes it a bit special from when it comes to, in comparison to other religions. So the four dimensions of Islam are basically this. You have Islam, which is, so we use the word Islam can denote the religion itself, and it can denote a dimension from it. So the word Islam as a dimension within Islam refers to the five pillars of Islam, right? The testimony of faith, which I spoke about, the five prayers a day, the fasting in the month of Ramadan, the paying of zakah, which is like charity, pretty much. I mean, similar to charity, but I don't want to get into it too much detail with it. So the fasting of Ramadan and the pilgrimage to the holy place, the house of what we deem to be the house of God in Mecca, right? The Kaaba, the cube-like building that you might have seen in some videos. That makes up this horizontal dimension of Islam. Then you have the vertical dimension of Islam, which is the faith in God, His angels, His books, His prophets, the Day of Judgment, and the divine predestination, stuff like that.
Hmm.
So that would be the vertical dimension of Islam, and then you have the depth dimension of Islam, which is ihsan, which means perfection in Arabic, and it is to achieve the state of worshiping God as if you see God, even though you don't see Him, right? And the final fourth dimension is the chronological dimension of Islam, which pertains to time and how we relate our lives with time. And that has to do with the signs of the Day of Judgment, right? And
Hmm.
these are things that the prophets spoke about that will come nearing the end of times. And these things are essential to the faith of the Muslim because they lead him to understand how God is active in the world via these signs that the prophets spoke of. And so this complete understanding of what Islam is, at the end of the day, will give you a kind of sense that Islam is a type of religion that looks towards affecting every single area of life. Islam is a religion that does go for this idea that we do every single deed for the sake of God. That includes fun, by the way. That includes anything that we pretty much do.
Hmm.
We're supposed to live for the sake of God, die for the sake of God, and resurrect us and be resurrected for the sake of God. Right? That's the ultimate goal. The main purpose in life is to worship God alone. And I suppose the one thing that stems out in Islam is that we avoid as much as possible the anthropomorphic usage of describing God. Obviously, we use things like metaphors and stuff like that, like speaking about the foot of God and stuff like that. Even though there's differences of opinion, and I'll get to that inshallah when it comes to sex in Islam. But the one thing that stems out is that we do believe that God is completely different to creation, and yet that He has attributes like sight and hearing that we can infer them, and yet they're nothing like creation. He's completely different, independent. He's timeless. We don't believe God enters time. We believe He is as He was, as He is, and as He always will be, beyond all of existence. And unlike Christianity, we do not believe that God has a son or that He becomes flesh.
All right. So we have some of those as the basics, and you've mentioned some of these as like dimension and all that, but some people usually see these as like you have the articles, and then you have the pillars,
Yeah.
being there. So what happens, for example, like let's say, because there's some people that then will get into the discussion about the Calvinism debate, where we have the 5 points of Calvinism, and then there's certain people called 4-point Calvinists, meaning that they affirm the other points except they reject limited atonement as that, and they could still be considered somewhat Calvinistic. We would just say inconsistent as a result. Is there room for that in, say, the articles or the pillars? Like, for example, like they affirm the 5 pillars and they affirm 5 of the articles, but if they reject the notion of qadar, would that person still be considered a Muslim?
I don't think that the person would be considered Muslim because, for example, if you deny Qadr, you're essentially denying that God's will is necessary, right? And that's essential to the Muslim theology, because if we were to deny that God determined all actions that will manifest and be created in the world, we'd be essentially saying that there's some kind of delegational power that things other than God have. In other words, things come about without God's will. Or it would maybe imply that if you're trying to say that God does determine all things, but maybe He doesn't know all things, so you're denying qadr in the sense of knowledge. So like God, this idea that God learns new things. We would say that is an act of disbelief, and that it does take a person out of the fold of Islam. So qadr as one of the 6 articles of faith is essential.
Okay. So would that then apply to any of the other articles or pillars?
Yeah, obviously, because it'd be kind of absurd to deny the belief in the existence of God, for example.
Right.
Right? Like you have to, in order for one to have faith in Islam, they have to believe in God, angels, books of God, the prophets of God, the Day of Judgment, and God's predestination, the Qadr.
Yeah, because there was actually a discussion I had with one guy in the Discord server at what was it, I just said it earlier, the Turkestan server, and he had a problem with the idea of God predestining things because of the issue of that. Well, if God predestined Adam, to fall, he referred to critiquing the Christian view, but then he talks about every other event, of which some of them can pay parallel into the Quran, that God had from the beginning this in mind for this to happen. That sounds very evil and wicked and demonic, according to him. And of course, he's no longer in the server. So, that's one of the reasons why I definitely wanted to make sure and clarify about that, because I know some people that are, very iffy on that whole kind of concept and notion. So. So we have some of those basic beliefs, that's understandable, but then here's another thing. There is a lot of sources for
right?
Islam. Like a lot of people just usually think it's just the Quran, and I had to show this to my stepmom the other day when I was showing her some stuff on Islam and all this sort of stuff. And one of the things that she then find out was, that there's this thing called the Hadith,
Right.
and that there's differences of it. All I know is that if you definitely want to see what a lot of them, would be used, there's Sunnah.com. That would be the one source, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but like considering you and where you're from on this, there's like 6 hadiths in terms of the main authentic collection of the hadith books, correct?
Yeah, there's 6 collections of 6 books of 6 standard canonical books of hadith, yeah, that
Mm-hmm.
people refer to that are the most authentic, right? And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, the 2 of them that are, like 99% authentic, sahih, are the Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih of Imam al-Muslim, right? These are 2 men that collected hadiths and had their methodologies, and they lived at the same time. The other books are also like they have a lot of sahih narrations. They do have some weak narrations and stuff like that, but there's a lot of methodology, a lot of research to be done to understand this science. It's probably the most complex science in out of the Islamic sciences, because it has to do with determining historical authenticity, which people are how do you determine what basically an authentic narrator is? What are the preconditions of
Mm-hmm.
detecting one?
Right.
Do we have to accept every sahih narration? Are there differences between sahih narrations? Like, it's not really a simple thing, and
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely layers of sahih, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
everything that's sahih is taken into jurisprudence, right? And this is one thing that a lot of people don't get. Islamic law is not equivalent to hadith, right? Islamic law or Sharia includes these sciences, and it's manifested through mostly fiqh. And fiqh is what we call and translate as Islamic jurisprudence into English. And
Which, by the way, for those that don't understand that particular word or are new to it, it's spelled FIQH
yeah,
in most parts. So just keeping that in mind in case you want to go Google this up later. But continue on.
yeah. So basically, like these are separate sciences, right? And for example, you mentioned the website sunnah.com, right? And obviously, I use this website myself because the opponents that I criticize for the Farid response channel use it themselves, but otherwise I wouldn't, because a lot
Hmm.
of the translation is very bad sometimes. And hadiths do have to be studied in the context of their Arabic meanings, because the Arabic language is very, very subtle. And I can really testify to that as a student of Arabic. The more I study it, the more I see how a simple change in the vowels, how a simple change in the case of a word, which is not something that we have in English, right? I mean, we have cases, but they're not, most people don't detect them in the English language. In the Arabic, they're detectable easily, and they can change meanings. And there's a lot of problems that occur in translation due to people basically not looking into the multiple meanings that one word can hold in dictionaries,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
Like a word can, for example, mean clouds, and a word can mean at the same time obscurity, right?
Hmm.
I think it's amma in Arabic. So, I mean, that's a important example, because it pertains to uh, what state, quote unquote state, even though I don't want to use that word for God, but what state God was in, right, before creating the world.
Yeah.
And so the hadiths might get mistranslated and abused to making up anthropomorphic conclusions and stuff like that.
Because I noticed that you have like there's that, and then there's a website called kalamullah.com which provides PDFs of some of these things, and they have a PD
Kalamullah, yeah.
and they have the PDF of these hadiths, but it shows them in what you would normally expect of the um, books from that you could buy from like Dar es Salaam or anything like that. And this is actually where what I think David Wood, for example, is putting up whenever he does the whole thing, because it's not in the format of the Sunnah.com, but it looks like it's an actual book thing. And when I did looking, it looked very parallel that it's from the Nasa, because it says the translators from Canada is Nasruddin Al-Khattab,
Mhm.
is usually who translates a good bit of these hadith collections that are here, but is also then published by Dar es Salaam, a popular Islamic bookstore in America. and they have not just simply the hadiths that are then written down, but they even will have like little footnotes sometimes when it comes to this. And that's something that I noticed that's missing in Sunnah.com, is that sometimes they won't have like the footnotes or anything like that mentioned in that. Which, speaking of, then, well, I guess before we get into this, let's get to another thing to explain Islam for some of these people. Is there's so many views in Islam. We're not talking just simply the Sunni and the Shia thing. We'll get to that in a sec. We don't need to go into Ahmadi, because I've already had an Ahmadi come on here before, and people are very familiar with some of those ideas. But so far, let's go down to the issue of the four schools of Sunni Islam, which is the majority of the Islamic world. You have the Hanafi, you have the Maliki, you have the Shafi, and the Hanbali school. I may have butchered those because, again, Arabic is not my mother tongue.
Don't worry.
What is, like, if you could find a way to easily explain to someone who's new to this thing, what makes, for example, Hanafi different than Maliki? What are the differences that make them in terms of, because as far as I'm understanding, they're the different schools of law, of schools of madhab. What's the difference that makes them their own thing?
Yeah, so as you said it at the end there, these are schools of law, right? They're madhabs, right? Mm-hmm. And madhab is an Arabic word which comes from the word dhahaba, which means to go. So it has to do with like it's a pathway, right? It's something that you take as a methodology. And basically, these are not theological schools, by the way. Theological schools are different, and we have traditionally speaking, there are three, and I'll get to that later, inshallah. Right. And there's a lot of divide in the modern times due to those. The people would argue for more or less, depending on how they approach it. But basically, these four schools that you mentioned, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and the Hanbali, schools are the standard Sunni law schools, right? And they differ. They're basically schools of interpreting law with different principles. And these schools would basically argue throughout history that these principles are based in the practice and the methodology of living of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And just to clarify what I just said in Arabic, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the Christian audience, in translation means, may God's peace and blessings be upon him. We always say these things when we mention the names of prophets, either Jesus or Prophet Muhammad or Moses or Adam or whoever among the prophets. We say these things because we believe that we ought to honor them, right, by invoking God's peace upon them, right? So just to make that clarification. But anyways, like, for example, I'm a Hanafi, right? And we have a lot of principles in our madhab. I think 11 as far as I remember. And some other madhabs will not use certain principles, right? And all of these madhabs have base principles in which they differ. However, they would all argue that their principles are valid. Now, historically, there's a lot of difference of opinion on whether these schools should accept each other or whether they should oppose each other vehemently. But I would say most people throughout history were very accepting of each other, even though they did criticize the other schools. So, for example, even though the Shafis did, for example, deem certain things the Hanafis do as complete falsehood, they would still consider them Muslim, right? There was no exceeding amount of takfir, although that did occur, to be fair.
And what's takfir again?
Takfir is basically excommunicating somebody out of faith. So it's basically when you deem somebody's not a Muslim anymore due to an action or a statement, right? Throughout most of history, these madhabs would not takfir each other. However, they would be very, very stern when it comes to their, main scholars. But the interesting thing is these four men, after whom these schools are named, are basically students and teachers of each other. So Abu Hanifa, who is the founder of the Hanafi madhab, did meet Imam Malik. He wasn't his teacher, but he did meet him, and they did have a nice conversation. And despite the differences, they agreed that they're great scholars and stuff like that. They spoke highly of each other. Imam Malik was a teacher of Imam Shafi, and Shafi was a teacher of Imam Hanbal, or at least lived at the time of Imam Hanbal, as far as I know. And somebody can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, as I'm not really familiar with the Hanbali school too much. So I'll give you an example of how they differ. For example, the Maliki school has a unique principle, which is called the deeds of the people of Medina. And this is unique for the Maliki school. So it says, for example, that The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he died in Medina, right, which is a city to which he migrated from Mecca after being persecuted for 10 years. In Medina, when he was established, he led the Muslims as a governor, and he died there. And so his final actions were demonstrated in that place. And now the Medinan school, the Maliki school, says basically there's 10,000 Sahaba or 10,000 companions of the Prophet that remained, that were alive when the Prophet, peace be upon him, died and passed away. And so the Maliki school says if these people agree on something in practice, we don't need necessarily a hadith to affirm of that action, because their actions as a majority is trusted enough. So, for example, the Maliki school, when they pray, they hold their hands on their sides. They don't fold them on their bellies, right? Because the majority of the people in Medina prayed with their hands on their sides. And the Maliki school would argue this is how the Prophet probably spent his last, this is how he prayed his last prayers, because these people massively transmitted through their actions how the Prophet prayed. Because they lived in Medina, right? So they must have seen him pray like that, or they must have seen other people who knew him pray like that. Hanafis would disagree. They would use principles like qiyas or analogy. They would emphasize an analogy and use analogical reasoning to compare certain rulings with other rulings to come up with the idea that we do have to fold our hands and stuff like that. So it's basically a difference in principles. At the end of the day, it comes up with fruits that are valid, and the Muslims do not, generally speaking, throughout history, we do not condemn each other for these differences. But they're very important, though, to be honest.
Okay, so like, what would be one particular important response? And hey, what do you know? I see Farid is or at least someone who's the manager of the Farid Response channel is in the chat.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum, Farid. What's up, dude?
So, like, what would be one of these importances that you, because you did say that they are, importance or differences, but that there's some of them are important. What would be one example?
Okay, so I actually spoke with this about this with Farid, and so for example, in the Shafi madhab, right, they don't take the principle of istihsan, which in translation is basically like preference and stuff like that, preference of something over another thing due to a certain condition, right? And so, for example, you have this might be a little bit disturbing to some people, but like you have the law of adultery, right? That adulterers, if they commit adultery publicly in front of 4 people or more that are pious witnesses, if they report them to the authority, then these people that committed adultery, under those conditions specifically, are whipped. And if the person is married, if one of them is married, they're stoned, right?
Yeah.
This is what we find in the law. And so, for example, the Shafi school will say if that happens, that has to be done, right? No matter what. And so the Hanafis, they would have a principle and they'd say, okay, what if another 4 witnesses come and say this didn't occur, right? So you have this problem of both of them, of both these groups, saying opposite things, and they're both equally pious and righteous. And so what do you do? Right. And so I as far as I remember from our discussion, and Farid can correct me on this, but I think this is what it was about. The Hanafis would say you do istihsan, or you prefer the opinion of them being innocent because there's an equivalent amount of people, but innocence is preferred over guilt. So they would differ on stuff like that. So these are very important differences. They can have major different consequences. And although this situation is a bit unrealistic, right? It does show you through what is called in logic a thought experiment, the importance of these differences, right? Because at the end of the day, these madhabs can come up with very radical different views. Like the Shafi madhab will maybe say that most of the time, most Shafis will say that if you touch a woman, that's not, if you have physical contact with a woman, you can lose your ablution. And ablution is what you take before praying, right? And the Hanafi madhab would say, as long as there's no desire and you touch a woman accidentally or something like that, as you're passing through, they say it's fine, right? So, and both these are exclusively mutually exclusive, right? And so it depends on how people are going to look at this. Some people might be very stern about it and say, well, the other one's prayer is invalid, right? Most people throughout history, as far as I know, would say that, well, okay, we deem this invalid, but in their principles, in their usul, in their principles of jurisprudence, it's valid, and so we're not going to deem their prayer invalid, right? Because they differ with us in principle. So due to their principles, they came up with that ruling, and due to our principles, we came up with an opposite ruling, right? However, there is critique by the more, I suppose, Salafi type of, how do I say it? The Salafi approach to Islam that would say, no, one of them has to be completely correct and the other cannot. Although, to be honest, even they differ among themselves, so I'm not going to speak about what these brothers and sisters in Islam think when it comes to those issues. But generally, yeah, these are important differences, and most of the time we don't condemn each other due to these, right? Because it's just unpractical, right?
Okay. So, and I want to get into that because usually that's what you'll hear on like Fox News these days, is that there is the mention of mostly two groups, is Salafi. You see Salafi, and then you see something along the lines of Wahhabi being another thing. In fact, I think that was actually a question
Right.
one time that was asked. It was usually asked by Christopher Hitchens towards Christians, is that, you know, he would ask, would you rather me be born a Muslim or me be born an atheist baby or a Wahhabi Muslim baby? And I didn't know like what that meant. I just thought it was like some kind of like, you know,
Didn't know he
particular.
said that.
I thought it was like a country or something like that. I was very new to the whole thing, and then I found out like, you know, you have Wahhabi, which apparently says some movement based off of this guy, of which wrote what is considered a very good standard work on the doctrine of Tawheed, Kitab al-Tawheed from Ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, which has like several commentaries. I looked and found like on the Kalamullah website, there's at least two of them, and then Yasser Qadi did his own commentary on this thing, if I'm not mistaken. But like it had a book where people wrote several commentaries on it. So what is, briefly, if you can explain, Wahhabism and Salafism?
Well, I need to be as neutral and fair as possible here, because I don't agree with those two movements, right? However, I do work with the brothers that are part of that type of understanding of Islam or madhab of Islam. I would say it's a modern kind of revival of the intention of this movement is basically to revive the following of the path of the Salaf, right? And the term Salaf means the pious predecessors of the Muslims, right? So the first three generations that came after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And this is a very important concept because the Prophet himself praised these three generations. He said that these are the best of people, the generation that he's in, then the generation that comes after him, and then the generation that comes after that, right? And so, you know, we have
and just before you continue, I just want to just ask if like people were to Google this up, then, you know, a hadith or something could be brought up where it would say, you know, where Muhammad would have said, you know, because I do know it's somewhere that said that these are the best generation, right? Just want to make sure that they could probably be able to look that up if they just like were to Google that.
Yeah, there is a hadith that says that. It's a Sahih hadith, and we definitely do accept it, all of us. To be fair, look, all of us do strive to imitate or follow. As Muslims, we have to follow the Salaf, the pious predecessors. We do deem that what they agree upon as a community is what is right? What is correct. Now, obviously, we differ in our understandings of it in the modern times and throughout history as well. There's a big divide between kind of Al-Ghazali Islam, which is the more philosophical, you know, dialectical theology focused Islam, and then you have the Ibn Taymiyyah type of Islam, which is an understanding of avoiding philosophy and not engaging in philosophy when it comes to describing God's attributes. In more modern times, we do have this kind of Salafi and what you would maybe say Ash'ari Maturidi divide, and these are basically divides where basically the Salafi movement kind of started, as far as I know, 300 years ago, right? And by this, I'm not saying necessarily that they're wrong, right?
Right.
This would not be a proof against them, right? So just to put it out there, and I have to be careful because we're brothers and sisters in faith, and I don't want to misrepresent anyone. But to my best understanding, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was a man that emerged in what we now call Saudi Arabia, and he had this movement of what he believed was reviving true monotheism within the Muslim community, right? Tawheed. And he wrote the book Kitab al-Tawheed, the book of about the monotheism or belief in one God, in order to revive this, what he believed was the revival of original kind of belief in Sunni Islam of the Salaf, of these pious predecessors. And so, since there's an emphasis on saying that maybe a big chunk of the Muslim community went astray, right, by, for example, developing things such as what you call tawassul and istighatha, which are seeking intercession and seeking help from saints of God, right? And now Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab would deem istighatha, along with Ibn Taymiyyah, who came in the 14th century, by the way. So this is an older problem, that seeking help from saints is actually an act of polytheism, an act of shirk, right? Which condemns somebody from basically from paradise. So it's a very important thing for this for this madhab of the Muslims. I personally have, I'm very open to being corrected on these things. My approach to these things is that the form of this kind of seeking of help from saints does simulate polytheism. However, it's not polytheism depending on the intention of the person doing it, right? And now obviously there's going to be disagreement to that. People will say just doing the form of it on its own is enough to condemn somebody as a polytheist. So that's one of the divides. Another one of the divides is basically what do we mean by the aboveness of God in relation to the throne of God? Do we mean that to be spatial and temporal, or do we mean that to be something that we cannot conceive, or do we mean that it's metaphorical, right? So these are the differences between the Salafis and the Ash'aris and the Atharis. The Salafis, it depends from a person to person, right? Some of them might deem God is not in space, God is not in time. Some of them will say God is in a direction, not like our directions in space. So there's still this kind of saying that God, even if he is in a direction, he's still, completely different, right?
Yeah.
You gotta respect this pure intentionality of saying that God is completely different from his creation. This is consistent throughout all the madhabs, that wherever you apply an attribute to God, we still say that God is not like anything else. But there's a lot of differences, and to be honest, to cover it is kind of impossible, and anything I say in a short amount of time will be unfair to any school of thought.
Right. And so I guess at that point then, like, if anyone wants to just look this up, they can do so in their spare time by looking up these particular individual schools and doing the research there, because I know kalamullah.com has one of those. I think in the it's either in the groups and sects or the Akida section or the knowledge section. Like there's areas where they do explain like the different the schools of jurisprudence, and then just fiqh itself. But I do want to go get to one thing because we talked about the four schools, and I think this should be the last thing before we start getting into the let's get critical of Islam thing, because like I said, don't want to seem too much ecumenical here.
Sure.
What is the Shia aspect? Because that's, if I'm not mistaken, like one of the minorities of Islam that's out there, and I don't know
Right.
how high a percentage rate that would be, considering the 95% is Sunni. So like when it comes to Shias, what's besides, and we've already talked about it before on, or at least I did on other things, where the thing was like the split, with Ali. As regards to the caliph, like who deserved to be the caliph that happens after Muhammad dies? Is it these other people, or should it be his relatives like Ali? What is ultimately the differences that divide the Sunnis and the Shias to where they are at?
Right. So the difference is a bit, they emerge as a political phenomena, right? Obviously, as a Sunni, I would say that there was no Shia, foundation in the beginning of the whole thing. I don't think they would even say that themselves. It kind of began with with these conflicts that occurred at the time of the as far as I know, caliphate of Ali radiallahu anhu. Radiallahu anhu in Arabic means may God be pleased with him, right? This is what we say when it comes to companions of the prophets. So basically, Ali and his group and another group of the companions kind of split off, and due to political turmoil, due to being set apart in different geographical zones, they received different types of information of what was going on. And as Sunnis, we would say that via the principle of good assumption, they did enter a conflict. However, they entered a conflict thinking that what they were doing was the best thing for the Muslims at the time, and that they did not intend to kill the other side, but that they were being, just simply prepared in case the other side did, plan on doing something that was a bit absurd. However, we do believe that most of these conflicts that happened in the beginning between Ali and who was on the other side with Aisha, who was the wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him. You have the example of the Battle of the Camel, right? And Farid did a really good lecture on that, and I do recommend that the guys watch it. It's on Muhammad Ejab's channel. And basically, when these two armies met, they kind of found the whole, event absurd, right? They didn't even, they were pretty much asking themselves, are we really going to fight, right? And so the battle kind of began due to individuals from the army causing problems. And this was one of the things that historically happened that the Shia later on used as arguments against the Sunnis, right? In the beginning, though, there was no Shia and Sunni conflict at all throughout throughout the first, basically, generation of the Muslims, right? The Sahaba. There was no Shias then. It was just all of them were basically Sunnis because all of them understood that they have to follow the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And there's a lot of details to these things. I didn't really study too much about this conflict, but it came up later on, 100 years later on, with the the appearance of groups that proclaimed that they have some kind of sanctity with 12 imams that are meant to lead humanity. It came about with basically some kind of this occultish mentality that Ali should have been the first caliph and that he was betrayed. There's a lot of abuse of Sunni sources. I mean, to be honest, this might sound a bit biased, but with my own research of what happened, basically, is that the Shia conflict kind of the Shia group kind of emerged as a political phenomena, right? That wanted to kind of oppose this narrative that I suppose Umayyad Caliphate was kind of giving later on, right? So there was no really theological dispute in the beginning. It was more political in the beginning, and then theological differences came about later. And there's a lot of Persian and Hindu influence in what the Shias believe.
Yeah.
Personally, but yeah, they do have their narrative. Not everything is black and white. Obviously, they do have some things that we can take as historically true. However, the main difference is we have the principle of good assumption, right? As Sunnis, they don't, right? The Shias don't do that.
So what's with what I believe is the Imam thing? Because I know there's the Twelvers, and then there's whatever this other group is, but essentially it's about the Imams. What is up with that?
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with it too much, but they basically have this notion that these 12 Imams, are meant as some kind of guidance to humanity, and that the Prophet's Sunnah and all that is transmitted through them, and that they have some kind of batini knowledge, that they have this kind of esoteric knowledge that is, that they're given by God and stuff like that, and that there's a lot of emphasis on the family of the Prophet ﷺ by the Shia, and they do have this idea that the family was abused by Umar and Abu Bakr, and we would argue that that's not the case, solely from the fact that they argue from our sources, right? And then we just simply have rebuttals to that idea, and we point out that these are not, that this is not the case historically, right?
Yeah. Well, and someone in the chat, Xeroid E, I guess when you're talking about the battle and everything, said that, quote, Aisha never approved the fighting.
Yeah,
Do you want
yeah,
to?
that's true. Yeah.
All right, just want to get that clarified there, since I guess he was trying to address that to you or something like that. I don't know. But
Yeah, that's true.
all right,
As
so
I said, the individuals are the ones that basically caused the fight at the Battle of the Camel. It was not really the commanders,
right,
right?
and so
But they responded to what happened in the battlefield, and just to prevent any kind of mass destruction or whatever.
So, first of all, let's get to this in case anyone wants to find any resources that helps explain it from an Islamic perspective. Because here's the thing. So far, it's starting to be where Farid... how do you pronounce that, by the way?
Farid, yeah.
Okay, so Farid. Because a while back I was saying Farid. And I was trying to make sure I don't, mispronounce it. Because if you think about it and you're saying the way that way too fast... it almost sounds like you're saying farted instead of Farid or anything like that. So I want to make sure I don't butcher the name too badly to an inconvenient situation. So Farid is one of them that I look into nowadays, especially his other channel, the Sunni Defense. Has been especially where I've looked to understand the issue between the Sunni and the Shias on that. But then of course other aspects and issues. Then there's also Dawa Man has been a guy I've looked to because he would always take these knowledge college classes and put snippets of them in a way that I see then that's where I think the problem is nowadays, is that I don't see a lot of you have the fatwa kind of things that are out there from some channels, but you don't really have okay, here's a full lecture or lesson that's free that we've given out on this whole kind of thing, but in the Christian circles, we had Ligonier Ministries, we had freebiblicaltraining.org, and then of course other things that are on YouTube. They're trying to give out these lessons, but I don't see much of that with regards to sometimes the Muslim world, where they're trying to help explain and educate people, not just in general of Islam, but even for some of those Muslims that want to know about their faith. Could you think of any from if there's any YouTubers or anything like that you would suggest as resources?
For Sunni Shia polemic specifically, or just generally?
Well, just in a general thing, if even whether it be the Muslim or the person that is not a Muslim but is interested in learning about Islam from their own scholars and perspectives, or YouTubers, who would you have recommend for the people in scholarship or da'wah?
Well, generally speaking, I think that I suppose it depends from area to area, right? I would definitely recommend lectures by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf when it comes to Islam generally. Just when you want to learn about the creed of the Muslims, the law of the Muslims, and what tasawwuf is. And tasawwuf is the science of the basically the science of the sincere inner directedness towards God. It's this inner science of Islam, inner aspect of Islam that has to do with our intentions and spiritual tendencies in life. And this does reflect with the 4 dimensions of Islam that I mentioned. There's also, these are not really YouTubers. These are just lectures that are recorded, right?
Right.
Online. I wouldn't recommend YouTubers of any faith to, unless they're scholars, right? As a source that you go to. But yeah, I would recommend Sheikh Hamza Yusuf when it comes to that. Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. But to be fair, I am a bit biased here, and they would give you the Ash'ari Maturidi perspective, right? They're not going to give you the Salafi perspective on Islam. If you want to get the Salafi perspective on Islam, you could, I suppose.
I heard there was, and funny enough, I was actually criticized for using this particular source. And I even follow him on the Twitter website, because apparently he does a little thing occasionally whenever he gets a chance to, do answer questions that are sent to him. And I'm trying to remember what his name is. I know he's one of the big popular ones that's on that popular Muslim channel, and I'm trying to remember the name, but he is a sheikh, I believe, has not gonna lie, and this is gonna sound pretty terrible of me, but the only way and I even thought this at first when I saw him is like, either that he was, from the Middle East, or that he was Korean. He kind of looked a bit like that, but he's got a recognizable.
Asim al Hakim, I think that's his name.
Yeah, Hakim. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to have a type of Salafi approach to understanding of, although to be honest, he just does Q&A sessions, right? Answers to fiqh and stuff like that. That I majorly don't agree with, right? But as I said, I'm coming here as a Muslim that does belong to the Ash'ari Maturidi perspective of Islam, right?
Yeah.
So, but if you do want to have a perspective of Salafi Islam, it's Asim al-Hakim, people like that. Muhammad Hijab, he's a Salafi, and most of the Sunni defense team are Salafis, but they do a good job. They do a good job that I agree with for the most part when it comes to Sunni Shia polemics.
Okay.
Right. So if you want to learn about Sunni Shia polemics from the Sunni perspective, or rather criticism of Shiism, then Sunni defense is your place to go, right? But I'm not gonna be the one to recommend Shia stuff. But there's stuff out there, to be fair. But yeah, I would definitely recommend the three scholars: Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Dr. Omar Abdullah Farouk, and Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad as sources for learning online if you want to really get into learning about fiqh and like jurisprudence and theology. Yeah, I would go to those three.
All right, I'll be sure to do so. So now let's get into what some people would be interested in seeing for sure, because we've had people on the standby that have been curious and listening in for the learning aspect. Now we're in for the issue where I'm going to start asking some questions here. So here's one question. In light of Christianity, if we're going to compare these two worldviews, why Islam over Christianity? Because I'm sure you've been exposed to some of the Christianity circles.
Right. Well, here's the thing, right? By Christianity, would we be talking about? Let's talk about it like from the perspective that we're talking about a small group of Christian denominations. You are yourself a Protestant, right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, I'm a Protestant. I'm a Southern Baptist, but I have Reformed thought. So like I would be much like the Southern Baptists, like Al Mohler and J.D. Greer and some of these other ones.
Right. So when we talk about Christianity in modern days, we're usually talking about either Protestant Christianity or Catholic Christianity or Orthodox Christianity, right?
Right.
We don't really talk about other groups if there are, right? And I don't think that there's too many anymore, right?
Right.
By Orthodox Christianity, I include Copts and Russian Church and whatever.
Yeah, like I would say that like the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic would sort of be parallel with the Shias in light of some of the the issue regarding the saints, and then they had praying to the saints, and then you had the issue of the imams and all that kind of stuff. I would sort of put that on a parallel, in my opinion.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So basically, I'll just answer this in a personal kind of manner. Why do I, for example, why would I go for Islam instead of Christianity, right? Well, I don't approach it from this kind of way of looking at what's wrong with Christianity first. I look at what's right about Islam, right? So the reason that I believe in Islam, the reason that I'm Muslim, is basically that, first of all, the Kalam argument, which is the most famous argument right now, is a solid proof and a deductive, conclusive argument that God exists, right? This is what I hold to be true. On top of that, the Kalam argument stems from the Islamic tradition and does have some influence of Christian scholars like John of Philoponus, possibly, to be fair. We're not definitely sure about that. But in any case, the Kalam tradition, for the most part, 95% of it is purely an Islamic kind of exercise. It contains proofs for the existence of one God, for the existence of this God being absolute in his essence. And although maybe on the apparent of it we disagree with that, or rather maybe on the apparent of it we agree in that God's essence is absolute. In essence, we do differ between the Muslims and the Christians do differ on that, because we would say that, for example, the Trinity would render God not absolute, right? But Mainly, on top of the proof that there's one God, the Quran as a historical phenomena, as a book, as a speech that was recited by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who was an illiterate person in a society that was drenched in Arabic poetry. For me as a student of language and for me as a student of Arabic, I can see that the Quran was completely a different form from what the Arabs used in literature. The Quran as a revelation is something that basically disabled the Arabs from doing something that they should have been able to do. On top of that, the Prophet, peace be upon him, is a great moral example. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he suffered in accordance with the hadiths, and he has prophecies and mass transmitted miracles that we know of. And these things point out to his prophethood. And my friend and brother Gibran, Jib ibn Aqal, or Gibran from Twitter and the Discord servers, is the one who gave me this argument, and he's the one who's mainly developing it on the basis of what the Islamic scholars historically argued for, which is that taking into account the Quranic revelation and the morals of the Prophet and his prophecies, we can conclude that the best explanation is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was a prophet of God. We would argue that the Quranic language can be detected to be from God due to its structure. I would argue that you don't necessarily need to know Arabic, but just that you can, go through certain lectures online, even like from Nu'man Ali Khan, where he speaks about these in the English language and talks about the intricacies of the language of the Quran, that point out to the idea that the Quran is actually not a human piece of literature, that there's an exceeding amount of rhetorical devices in it that point to the concept of it being non-human, and in context of what the Prophet claims Muhammad to be a prophet of God, and the mass transmitted miracles, and the Arabs being disabled from responding to the Quran historically as transmitted by the Hadith, point to his prophethood. And due to those historical facts and the Kalam arguments for God, I would say that this gives us the best option to believe in Islam after being alive in the period of Muhammad or after him. Maybe before being alive during the Prophet, before being alive, like if I was alive before the Prophet Muhammad was born, I probably would have been a Unitarian Christian, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be the most rational way to go with in life, because Jesus is not somebody that I would ignore in my life. Definitely, he's a great prophet and a slave of God for me. But we do not believe that he's a son of God. So yeah.
So. I want to ask if you're familiar with the transcendental argument for the existence of God, because you mentioned the Kalam, but if you're familiar with the transcendental argument.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, but it's based on presuppositionalism, and I do not like it because of that.
Why is that?
Well, here's the thing: like it has this. The transcendental argument basically leads us to the conclusion that these kind of abstract knowledge, how do I say it, forms of knowledge have to have a rooting or have to have a grounding in some kind of ultimate entity that grounds all knowledge, and this would be God. But I would argue that the mere existence of God does not have any explanatory power for knowledge or epistemology, right? I would argue that just because you conclude God exists, or because you assume God exists, this does not give you any more knowledge of, I don't know, for example, I see an apple in front of me, I know it's an apple, right? If I believe in God or don't believe in God, it doesn't matter, I still know that it's an apple, right? Mm-hmm. So I would say that due to that it's a weak argument. Yeah.
But then here's the question in that regard: how would you know that is an apple that is there?
Well, I'm an externalist in epistemology, so basically I would say that we are justified in our beliefs we're justified in our beliefs as long as there's no proof against them, right? So in other words, if my senses are not failing me, if my senses are in a stable environment, and I can determine this due to inductive and I can determine this by looking at when my senses fool me and when I'm aware of them fooling me, right? And so I can use these samples to determine when my senses are not fooling me. And so when I'm aware that they're not fooling me, and I see something in front of me, like, for example, this, this book that I have in my hand right now that I'm holding, I know my senses are not failing me. I know I'm not drunk or something like that. And so I see the book and I'm holding it in my hands. I have no reason to deny that it's a book. and therefore I conclude that it's a book, right? There's no external reason or thing that disproves my belief. So I'm rational and justified in what I believe due to my senses not failing me, due to them being clear.
Right,
Right?
but
And
when you're
being a
testing
lack
them,
of reason to deny it, right?
but when you're testing them there, that still is presupposing the reliability of your senses of which you are trying to test.
I would say that it's not, because the reason that I would say it's not is that this actually works off of intuition. So, for example, let's say I'm a small child, right, and I have a stick
Mm-hmm.
in my hand, and I go to a river, right, and all the time while I'm carrying a stick, I see that the stick is not bending, right. Intuitively, I conclude that the stick is a stable object, right? It doesn't bend, even though I'm moving through, through space. And eventually, I reach the river, right, where I'm heading, and I use the stick and I put it deep inside the river, right? And then I see that the stick starts uh, to bend from the top of the water, right? Because I've stuck it in the river, and there's like a reflection of light and this and that, right? Now, on the first glance of it, uh, I will believe that, as a child, maybe the water bends the stick, right? And so that might be my initial thought. However, if I touch the stick from top of the water and I remove it from the water and I enter it back again into the water, and I keep
Mm-hmm.
checking if the stick has some kind of deformity when I put it back in the water, and I feel through my fingers that there's no such thing, I still know that the stick is stable, right? So I can conclude that there's an effect in the water that made my sense of sight fool me. However, due to my sense of touch, I'm not fooled anymore, and therefore I'm justified in my belief, because there's no reason for me to think anymore that the stick is bending, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I might have been rational in that moment to think that the stick is bending due to the water effect being unknown to me, but after checking multiple times, I figured out that there was an illusion, and now I know. Now I have experience of what it means to be deluded, right? And therefore, I have intuitively developed a method by which I can see what delusion is and determine in a better way when my senses are fooling me and when they're not, right? So next time I meet something in water and I stick something in it, I'll know that the thing is probably not bending; it's just an effect of the water, right?
So you would say that based off of that, you then would have complete knowledge of what every single possible illusion or deception of the senses would be as a result.
every single delusion that water might be causing, I would have some kind of perception of it, yeah. But I do have to have experiences of different types of illusions to detect what they're like.
And
Yeah.
it's possible there could be illusions that you haven't come across, correct?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, correct.
Okay. So, because here's the thing, like and I'm gonna quote from this. There was a book called, if I'm not mistaken, it's called Canon Revisited: Establishing the Origins and Authority of the New Testament Books by Michael Kruger. And in that particular book, he mentions and comments on this sort of thing here about what you were talking about with the analogy you gave on analyzing something. He says, quote, "This sort of circularity is not a problem, but simply part of how foundational authorities are authenticated. For instance, let us imagine that we want to determine whether sense perception is a reliable source of belief. If I see a cup on the table, how do I know my sense perception is accurate? How could I test such a thing? I could examine the cup and table more closely to make sure they are what they seem to be, hold them, touch them, etc. I could ask a friend to tell me whether they see a cup on the table. But in all these instances, I am still assuming the reliability of my sense perception or my friends, even as I examine the reliability of my sense perception. Or as another example, let us imagine that we wanted to inquire into whether our rational faculties would reliably produce true beliefs. How could we examine the evidence for the reliability of our rational faculties without, at the same time, actually using our rational faculties and thereby presupposing their reliability? William Alston sums it up: there is no escape from the epistemic circularity in the assessment of our fundamental sources of belief. So what are your particular thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, what I'm getting from that is that if we have some kind of introspective experimentation with our beliefs. So if we try to rationalize, for example, some kind of tautology, let's say, like the law of non-contradiction, what the author might be implying is that the very fact that we're using reason to propose certain, what you would say, I suppose, are justified true beliefs, or rather, not justified true beliefs, but like laws of logic, that we would have to presuppose the reliability of our mind in order to actually um, have them work, right? But I don't think that what's going on is presupposing per se. I think that what's going on is basically uh, there are things in logic that, for example, like the law of non-contradiction, that are true in every possible world, right? And what I mean by that is that even if you affirm or deny, even if you affirm or negate the proposition of the law of non-contradiction, you will get the same result, right? You will get the same result um, of the logical form, right? And the law of non-contradiction can be put in a logical form, and if you look at it, it gives you the same result, whether it's affirmed or denied. And what I'm trying to say is basically there are things in our mind that are inconceivable, like, for example, a tautology not being true in any possible world. We can't really conceive of that. But that does not mean that we're presupposing the tautology to be true. That just means that we cannot conceive of it other than being true, right? And therefore, it's just a rational process that leads us to acknowledging that we have justified true beliefs in things without necessarily, um, backing them up with some kind of external evidence, right? These things are in on themselves evident, right? They are such that they're tautologies, right? They're true whether you negate them or affirm them, and this has to do with some stuff in syllogistic logic. And there's a great book by Julian Baggini, Philosopher's Toolkit, and he comments on this when he comes to the passage of the law of non-contradiction.
All right. So I want to go over one thing, because there's one person who would definitely be used in favor of this particular kind of argument, and the presuppositional approach. Dr. Greg Bahnsen. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Bahnsen.
No, I'm not.
He basically was one of Cornelius Van Til, who invented the presuppositional apologetic method, and Bahnsen was one of the students who would then champion and use it against several atheists that were popular at his particular time, such as Gordon Stein and Edward Tabash, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, Edward Tabash actually debated Muhammad Hijab.
Yeah, on liberalism, though, yeah.
Yeah, so like back before...
Is the Norwegian guy, yeah?
Huh?
The Norwegian guy, yeah?
I don't know if he is Norwegian or not. I don't know too much about Mr. Tabash, other than Edward Tabash is as a lawyer. But I did see that.
Yeah. That's him. Then that's him. Yeah.
Yeah, Edward Tabash and Muhammad.
Oh no, yeah, he debated. Yeah, that's a different person. Sorry, my bad. Yeah, he did. Yeah, Edward Tabash is a lawyer. They did debate whether God exists. Yeah.
Yeah, and before that, several years ago, they debated him and Greg Bahnsen debated the same subject back then, and that's where a lot of the highlights of Greg Bahnsen on video are usually from, is where he responds to all the claims that are made against him, and trying to prove the Bible exists, how do you know God exists, and all these sorts of things. But he had a dialogue in a college campus, I forget where at, with a Jew and a Muslim, and according to the Penpoint Volume 2, Issue 6, I believe is what that 6 is there for, but basically it was published in November 1991. It states one of the criticisms that, because what Greg Bahnsen seems to do is basically point out that in a comparison of the worldviews, in other words, of the different religions and philosophical ideas out there, Christianity is the only one that would be able to be consistent in all the different forms of the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, the the laws of is morality absolute or anything like that. So he basically tries to argue that out of all these different things, Christianity is the only one that can be consistent in those particular claims. And in one of his criticisms that's noted in this Pinpoint article, which reviews his debate, his response to the Muslim at one point apparently was, and this is the quote from the review, quote, Dr. Bonson argued that the Islamic doctrine of tanzih, or transcendence, which says that no human language can positively describe Allah because he is allegedly incomparable, and gives the citation of Surah 42, Ayah 11, would render it logically impossible for the Quran to be what it claims to be, a positive revelation and description of Allah. So what are your thoughts with Dr. Bonson's particular critique in trying to say that the doctrine of tanzih, or the doctrine of the transcendence in Islam of Allah, is a sort of self-refuting notion of itself?
Yeah, well, this has to do. There's a kind of. I actually debated this with Jay Dyer on his Discord.
Oh, I feel
recently.
sorry for you knowing him.
Yeah. So I basically we discussed that, and I think there's a lot of mention of what is Aquinas' kind of approach to theology, which in Summa Theologia, I think that's the name of the book.
Yeah, Summa
that we can
Theological.
only Theologica. Yeah, sorry, my bad.
No, you can.
And he basically argues, as far as I know, that we can only speak about God in analogical terms, right? That there's only analogous speech, rather analogous speech of God's essence and his attributes and stuff like that. That we can only know that God is different to everything by revelation and not by reason. Now, my problem with that is there might be a bit of a misunderstanding in what we mean by tanzih right there. Basically, the way that our scholars address this is by saying that when we refer to God as, for example, the seeing, right, the one who sees, as Sami', right, or astaghfirullah, al-Basir, as Sami' would mean hearing, my bad. So al-Basir, Allah is the seeing, right? God is the seeing. He sees all things. And we say, for example, Huwa Basir, he is seeing for a human being, right? We can say that. But we don't say Huwa al-Basir, right? We don't give it a definitive article, just to point that out. What we mean by that is basically the syntax is the same, right? The word that we're using, the descriptions that we're using have the same form. However, the meaning is completely different, right? In other words, God does have a seeing, right? What is seeing. However, the meaning of it is ultimately known to God, and the likeness of it, the howness of it, is ultimately known to God. A good explanation of this would also be to say that God's seeing is necessary, while our seeing is contingent, right? And so, when we say that there's nothing like him and he's the hearing, the seeing, or rather when the Quran says that, what it's basically saying is that, okay, his essence is completely transcendent. We cannot imagine God, right? However, we can conceive of attributes of God, right? And these attributes become known to us by him manifesting them in the world. In other words, when you see a human being, when you see that God is giving sight to a human being, he's signaling what sight is, for you to conceive what sight is, right? As a phenomena. Now, God will say that he's seeing, and so you have a conception of what sight is. However, God's seeing not is like we don't say that it's in some kind of relation to the human seeing, ultimate or maximal. No, it's beyond that. It's actually unimaginable. However, we can conceive of it in the sense that we know it's seeing. However, we don't know the howness of it. We can't imagine what it's like, right? We're just aware that it's seeing, and we can know of it by two means. We can know by the means of revelation, right? God reveals that he's the seeing, or that he's the hearing, or we can infer it through logical proofs. And there are some logical proofs that our scholars argued for that would prove that God sees, right? However, our understanding is simply that we're using these same words, however, they have completely different meanings and realities, right? In essence. Right. So, in other words, it's not a metaphor or an analogy. It's simply that we're using what is classed as seeing. However, the reality of it is completely different to the human seeing.
All right. Now, I want to get into where I have my issues, and that is in engaging in not the theology aspect per se, but rather the issue of and you should know from what we've discussed in the past, the textual critical side of things. And in fact, I got one resource that I've been taken into a look at, and it's the first of its kind from what I had found out. It's from Nikolai Sinai, The Quran, a historical critical introduction, which is a part of the New Edinburgh Islamic Surveys series of academia. So it's a interesting book so far. I'm trying to keep up on reading it because I'm in 3 to 4 other books that I'm alternating between. So it's sometimes hard trying to then get back into one of them, and you're in the mood of trying to find that perfect mood to get back into it. But from what I've read so far, there's the 2 chapters I've read is some of the basic features of the Quran, which explains the surahs, how do we get the surahs and its formation there, the text type that it is used in terms of the basic razam, and then the different little dots that are then put onto it, which gave me to learn something interesting based off of what it stated, and then what I had to look into, and I'll get to asking you this in a bit.
Sure.
But
if I may just add some comments, I remembered something when it comes to last question, right?
Yeah.
If I may.
Yeah, sure.
So for example, Hume spoke about this idea of us being unable to conceive of God if he's completely transcendent, right? When we speak of him. But he had to, because he had this idea of analogous understanding, right? But he had to make exceptions in his rules, right? And an example of that is the idea of a tribe that lives in a remote place in Earth that does not see a specific type of color, right? Now, can they detect that color properly and give it a new name and name it without referring to other colors? Studies show that, yeah, that's the case. Yeah, they can conceive of new colors without ever seeing any kind of, color that's similar to it, right? And they can even detect different shades of that color. So I would say that the human mind is capable of seeing or conceiving of something that is not related to anything else in its modality, at least. And that it's enough for the human mind to understand that a color is a color, right? So when you see a completely new color, you can conceive it's completely different in modality, but you know that it's a color, right? I'm not saying that this is the exact same thing when it comes to God, but he certainly proves that we don't require analogy when it comes to knowing things that are unknown to us, right? It proves that we don't require an analogy for everything that we know of. There's things that appear in our mind that are new conceptions that don't require an analogy, right? And I think, the best example of it is simply the idea that God is the necessary being, right? How do we know that God is the necessary being? We infer that through the fact that we live in a possible world, and that the possible world requires a necessary being. We've never seen a necessary being with our eyes. We've never seen a necessary thing in the world. We live in spatial temporal reality. However, due to the possible world being such that it requires a necessary being, we know that the necessary being is that which is completely other than the possible world, which exists, right? And so it has this quality of existence, but it's completely different from the possible world in that it's self-sufficient. It exists on its own, and this is an attribute that we have to agree on, that we can't relate to with analogy, and yet we conceive of it, right? You can maybe say, oh well, there's a strong man that never moved from his place, but we can't really say that because all of us know that men began to exist and they move and they waver, they become weak, and so we can't relate that to God, right? Because God's self-sufficient necessary existence is known to us, and yet we never see such a thing in the world, right? But we can infer it, right? Anyways, go on.
All right, so I'll send in a real quick thing to a friend of mine real quick, but yes, the book just goes into some basic stuff regarding the issue of the basic features of the Quran. Then the next chapter was Muhammad and the Quran, which, again, it being a historical critical introduction, and I believe the author is He is the Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the Oriental Institute at Oxford University and a fellow of Pembroke College at Oxford. And he's published several scholarly articles on the Quran and has worked on essays contributing to collected issues. And as far as from what I've heard, he's currently working on a critical tafsir of the Quran, which means he's like gathering as much tafsirs that he can find to analyze one specific verse, and also going over some critical analysis of these points. But apparently it's going to take years for it to eventually get to it, because he's also like taking some Arabic only tafsirs and at the same time translating them into English for the people to look at. So he's a pretty big scholar in the world of these Quranic studies over in Oxford and such. But and I say that because in the Muhammad in the Quran, besides mentioning some good things in some of these aspects, he does mention some other theories without necessarily putting down and saying that this is his position or he thinks that this is true. Like he mentions that there is debate about the existence of Muhammad by some scholars, and some debate that saying Muhammad's name Muhammad was not his name, but rather it was a title that was given unto him. And he cites one scholar that would have that particular theory in case people want to look it up. But one thing that came across whenever I was closing in this section.
It's the first time I heard this, by the way, that that the name Muhammad is a title, actually. Never really heard that before from anyone. Oh,
yeah, trust me. I was the same way. Like, I never, heard that particular idea. And so I'm glad that he at least cites, other scholars where they explain the different theories so people can get into bigger dialogues on this. But then here's what I found even more interesting that I never heard of, was discussion of said, and this is the section he labels it as, quote, post-Muhammadan additions to the Quran, where he mentions two verses that are up to debate in some of the academia as to whether they were put in there after the time of Muhammad's death. And the debated verses that he cites they all come from Surah 3, and it's either verse 7 or verse 144, which he doesn't lean too much and thinks that there's easily good ways to explain those claims, because he cites like Dr. Shoemaker and who was the other one he mentions in there? There's Dr. Hirschfeld and Dr. Shoemaker, that they proposed this idea, but he explains that it can easily be explained that of how Muhammad could have been the one who wrote this. But he thinks that verse 7, where it talks about and I'll just quote this so that way we kind of get an understanding of what is being the argument. He says the verse famously posits that the scripture kitab sent down upon the Quranic messenger contains verses that are firm or clear, ayat, mukamat, and others, and others that are, as you said, mutashabah.
Mutashabihat,
literally resembling one another, but here obviously used to mean ambiguous. The verse then condemns those who pursue what is ambiguous in scripture, seeking temptation and seeking its interpretation. This admission that certain parts of the Quranic corpus are inherently ambiguous and that their interpretation is bound to remain inaccessible stands in stark contrast to an impressive roster of other verses, the Quran's frequent insistence on its own intrinsic clarity, the assurance in 75, ayah 16 through 19, that God himself will see to the clarification of existing Quranic revelations, presumably in subsequent ones, and a statement implying that all of the Quran, not just certain parts of it, have been made firm, Surah 11, ayah 1. As opposed to these passages, Surah 3, ayah 7 confines the property of clarity or firmness to a textual chord designated as the al-Kitab, the mother of the scripture. And so that's the general introduction, but then he, as he goes on to comment, he says, quote, thus Surah 3, ayah 7 can be read as addressing a community in possession of a scriptural corpus that because of the death of Muhammad was not felt to admit significant revision and growth anymore, yet nonetheless appeared to be characterized by considerable ambiguity. Against this hypothetical background, Surah 3, Ayah 7 would provide a rudimentary guidance on how to deal with the Quran's seemingly inescapable ambiguity, namely by discouraging its addressees from pressing scriptural passages that seem enigmatic and obscure, and by urging them to concentrate on scripture's readily intelligible core instead. So that's where he sort of gets the idea, and others have gotten the idea that this would be post Muhammad, is that they've already seemed to gather and have collected this corpus, because it's not just, while it's oral and there's also the different little fragments for memory aiding skills, there's the fact that they have the collection of it, and they want to make sure that nobody presses on this particular thing and that it's clear scripture. And so he's basically saying that the wording seems to be, it could only have been written in a context of which to make sure that no one goes outside of, say, interpreting what's already been there, especially by some of its critics.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, here's the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it's an interesting argument, right? Does he make any comment on the verse after it, number 8?
Actually, funny that you mentioned that. Let me go back to the page. He mentions a final consideration is the entire sequence of Surah 3, Ayah 7 through 9.
7 to 9, right?
Yep.
So he claims that the 7 to 9 is basically put in there by the Muslim side to resolve an issue, basically, from what I'm getting.
Well, from what I gather, so far it just seems to be verse 7, but he mentions the sequence of 7 to 9. He says, quote, can easily be lifted from its literary context. Verse 10 would link up with verse 6 without an obvious gap. So he's saying that if you would lift those 3, even though he doesn't really try to put too much on 8 and 9, says if you were to remove verse 7 and 9, the flow seems to be, not missing any context or anything like that.
Right. Okay. So, look, here's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that solely, there's a lot to address there. First of all, I don't think that it's a valid way of him to argue against the Quran by saying, oh, well, if you lift these verses, then... like, for example, let's say we take random verse from Surah Al-Baqarah, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we take verse, let's say 7, I think. Let me remember. Let me open it up. Actually, let me open it up.
All right.
So, for example, let's say you take verse. Verse 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
And let's say somebody said, and those who believe in what has been revealed to you and what was revealed before you and of the hereafter, they are certain, right?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose he could make the same argument and say, okay, well, if you lift number 5, the sequencing could still go, and just say, indeed, those who disbelieve, it is all the same for them, whether you warn them or do not warn them, they will not believe. Skipping verse 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that you can pretty much have this kind of unfair criteria and do this kind of lifting of verses in the Quran to say that, this explains how and why they added it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the sequencing part. I'm not talking about verse number 7. Now,
right.
Having said that, I would say that the argument for saying that verses number 8 and 9 were lifted,
mm-hmm.
Or that they could be part of this, rather that they could be part of this kind of fabrication, I suppose, that's being alleged, and that the justification for it is that if you lift it, the context doesn't break
mm-hmm.
between number 6 and 10. Having said that, that's invalid in my opinion, and I've given my reasoning, because you can do it with pretty much everything, and I think that's a bit of an unfair criteria. I would say that on top of that, if you take the idea that 8, 9, and 10 are part of the Quran, then I would say that it automatically follows from knowing what number 8 says, which is رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا, our Lord, do not let our hearts deviate after you have guided us, and grant us from yourself mercy, indeed you are the bestower. That this goes in with the context of number 7, and therefore since 8 goes perfectly with number 7, I don't think it could have been interpolated. Like I don't think that number 7 could have been put because of that reason. Because here's the thing: if we're trying to say that 7 was, uh, because here's the thing: if 7 was put in there, then what that would mean is that this is how the original Quran, then in that alleged theory, would go. Number 6 would say, "It is He who forms you in the wombs, however He wills. There's no deity except Him, the exalted in might, the wise." And then all of a sudden, they're calling upon God and saying, "Our Lord, let not our hearts deviate after You have guided us and grant us from Yourself mercy. Indeed, You are the bestower." There's no connection between the two, right? Because they're asking for God to not deviate them after, it has been mentioned that they were formed in the wombs, right? You can't really correlate those things, right? So I would say that then 8 necessitates the verse number 7. And since 8 is definitely, in my opinion, I would say that it's definitely from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it would necessitate number 7 to be from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. I would say that there's a lot of naturalistic reductionist presupposing in this argument. Yeah.
All right.
That'll be my answer.
And I do want to point out one more thing as well, because while again he seems to lean more strongly here, he does say, quote, "It is distinctly possible, therefore, that verses 7 through 9 form a secondary interpolation into the surah," but then he goes on to say, and this is the part of the conclusion of his chapter here, is, of course, even if verses 7 through 9 are a later addition, this does not require them to post-date Muhammad. Yet while many similar additions can be perfectly well accommodated within Muhammad's lifetime, the perspective of Surah 3, Ayah 7 is quite distinctive insofar as the verse would appear to bespeak a vision of the Quranic revelations as a closed corpus. The case for a post-prophetic date is not negligible. Even so, the addition, if it is one, must have been made very early, perhaps within a few years of Muhammad's death, since Surah 3, Ayah 7 is already contained in an early manuscript that has been carbon dated to the first half of the 7th century, of which the footnote for that, let me go to it because I forgot to take a look at this whenever it came out. Oh, he links to a website on corpuscoronicum.de.
We're talking about verse 10 now, yeah?
Or verse 7, because he says that
7.
it's that verse 7 is found in a very early manuscript that is said to, according to him, that's able to be found on corpuscoronicum.de, able to be found in a manuscript carbon dated to the first half of the 7th century. It seems to say, because I'm trying to see if I can read this as what it is, manuscript Qaf 47. And it says the parchment of the manuscript has been dated with a probability of 95.4% to 606 to 52 AD. And that's another thing that I want to get into in regards to some of the things, because I know you might not see this as a criticism, and I personally don't, honestly, but I know a lot of Muslims, when they try to usually do the whole preservation of the Quran thing, they say that they have, you Christians don't have a manuscript of the Bible from the time those people have it, but we have a manuscript of the Quran from the time that comes and was written during the time of Muhammad, and by that they referred to the Birmingham Quran.
See, here's the thing. I would definitely not go that way. Yeah.
Good.
And the reason being is that I believe that the Quran is and was always meant to be recited oral tradition. Right? Obviously, it's written down, but it was written down. The compilation of the Quran was mostly written down for practical purposes of knowing what standardized version of it we would follow for recitation. Right? As far as my research, serves me, I don't think Uthman radiallahu anhu was intending to necessarily do it to just preserve the Quran, but it was on top of preserving at least one edition of a mushaf, right? One book, one page-to-page cover of the whole thing. He wanted to do that because there was no such thing before, right? Except I think it was compiled during the time of Abu Bakr as well, but not. It was gathered but not compiled into one mushaf. That's what I'm trying to say. It was not made into one book,
right?
And so his intention was that. Now, my own argument is that the Quran was mainly preserved through recitation, right? And you have very good examples of, for example, villages in Mauritania where these people would not even see. They've been Muslim their whole life. They're old people, right? And they've never seen uh, the Quran written down on paper, but they're Hafiz, right? They know the whole Quran from their heart. So I would say that the main method of transmission of the Quran and preservation was oral preservation, right? Even the hadiths are such as that. They were written down, sure, years later and compiled into big books, but they were generally thoroughly examined through speech, right? And then scholars would write them down separately in different categories, right? And so maybe the early onset of preserving the Quran was like that, but it was a bit more faster when it comes to putting it into one compilation, unlike the hadiths, right? Because it's a smaller amount of speech, right? Because the Prophet's
Right.
speech, there's a lot of there's more context, right? Because it's an explanation of his life and his um, yeah,
Hmm.
interpreting the Quran basically.
So the one thing that I mentioned, or that I wanted to mention, that it's in with regards to the particular thing about the Quran there to the manuscript, is, and this is one thing I had to really pay attention to, is that you have, of course, what is usually attributed as the Uthmanic manuscripts. You know,
Right?
like the Tope copy, the Samarkand, the um, I believe the Sa'ana is one of those other ones that's used.
Yeah.
And I noticed that every single time I look at those, the one key thing is that it basically has the basic consonantal skeleton, also the that the rasm there is no dots or anything like that in any of the
Right.
Sa'ana or the Samarkand or the Topkapi, um,
Um,
and from not just Nikolai Sinai, but some other people that have commented on the science of the Quran, like Yasser Qadi, and there's another guy who wrote the history of the Quranic text. That's a popular work from what I've heard. All describe that basically that diacritical marks and all these sorts of little dots and everything don't come in until the time of I believe it's either says that it's no, it has to be after Uthman. That sometime shortly after Uthman, in order to then help distinguish certain words and better pronounce them,
yeah.
as well as to spell them out better. Instead, because remember the Quran used to mostly just be oral, so it didn't matter on the consonantal skeleton at that point. But others then
Right.
who were reading it, needed necessarily that particular thing. So then that's when the diacritical marks and those were made. And if you look at the manuscript of the Birmingham Quran, what you do find, and this was pointed out by one guy named Al Samurai or something. His name was he did a lecture and then a interview on the Birmingham Quran, what he discovered and why he thinks it's not dated to the time of Muhammad, in light of what the carbon dating suggests, is that while carbon dating can only tell you when the animal or whatever that was used to make this particular paper died, then there's the writing and the ink that hasn't been dated, and then you have to look at the writing techniques that also tell you, because you could keep and stockpile paper, but it'd take a while before you write it, and
Yeah.
and
And
it
it takes time to tan it as well, the skin of the animal as well.
oh yeah, and so they found diacritical marks within the rasm, and thus that's got some people to suggest it is after Uthman, and not during the time of Muhammad. But there are still some that think that if we disagree with that, then we're somehow against the Quran, or we're trying to disprove the Quran or
I'm sure it's
Islam.
possible. I mean, it's possible. Here's the thing. I'm very open about these things because, as I said, for me, the preservation of the Quran is manifest through the fact that, the Sunnis and the Shias and so many sects of Muslims, we all agree on the default 7 or 10 recitations that we have of the Quran. There's only one sect that's called Shirazis that believe that the Quran is that the Quran was, which is a Shia sect that believe that the Quran was corrupted,
Oh, I
pretty
think I
much.
may have been talking to one of them recently, because I actually did talk to someone who said that.
Yeah. So, Mm. Yeah, like here's the thing. Like if a thing is mass transmitted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, we shouldn't really be so close to the Bible either, right? As
Right.
Muslims, we don't. For example, when we have the issue of crucifixion, right? The Quran does make this very bold statement that Jesus Christ was not crucified, right? Even though what is massively transmitted by people in the Bible, according to the Bible and according to stuff like that, is that he was crucified, right? Now, the issue is, we would simply say that, okay, we don't deny a crucifixion, but we do have that, explanation of this appearing to people to be the case, this being a different person being on the cross that looked like Jesus. We would give these modules, right? And as I said, I don't know if I told you this in our previous talks, but as I said, if I lived before the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, I would probably believe that Jesus Christ was crucified. However, due to the Prophet, peace be upon him, emerging as a prophet, from my perspective at least, I do believe that he serves as that his miracles in the Quran serve as a historical defeater. In other words, they serve as a new standard in history that appears, which is a direct revelation of God, that gives us a new piece of information that Jesus wasn't crucified. And had it not been the case that I had good arguments, for the Quran and for the miraculousness of the Prophet and the ideas of what Islam is, I would not, deny, not deny, but like I wouldn't negate the crucifixion. But since there are other historical factors that appear with the Prophet, peace be upon him, miracles that appear, I use it as a historical defeater for what occurred, right, with Jesus. And so, what I'm saying is, we as Muslims, we do believe in the concept of mass transmission. When things are massively transmitted by thousands of people, in the same way, it's rational to accept that these people didn't conspire in doing that, right? So what might have been the case is that whoever was crucified, for example, in your narrative, was thought to be Jesus by people, and people massively transmitted as that. But then we have mass transmission of the Prophet Muhammad's miracles, and that serves as a historical defeater for what happened throughout history. So yeah.
So, because of the transmission of who Muhammad is and what he has stated, then that could contradict or invalidate then what happens supposedly within the transmission of who Jesus was and what happened to him.
Yeah, and I would say that. Hold on, one sec.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Take the time you need, man. So let me make sure to keep see how many we got. About 10 people still watching at the moment.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, you're good, man.
So basically, here's the thing. I would argue that, like, for example, I would argue that the unlike the Islamic narrative where we have mass transmission of miracles and this mass transmission of recitation of the Quran that is evident through the schools in Basra and Kufa, these cities where people practice tajweed, the rules of Quranic recitation in vast detail, where they agreed on these recitations, didn't oppose each other when it comes to the standard ones, the standard 7 or 10 ones, depending on how you look at it. They were all preserved, right? Even if they were considered less authentic or more authentic, right? There's no lack of preservation in terms of recitation, right? And I would say that, unlike the Christian tradition, I wouldn't agree that the resurrection is true, for example. I would say that this isn't massively transmitted. The Christians would argue, people such as respected Dr. William A. Craig and perhaps Alvin Planting as well would argue that, using the minimal facts theory, we can conclude that there was a resurrection and that's a miracle of Jesus in history. And although I agree with the approach, I don't mind the approach of minimal facts. I don't think that it's consistent with what the Bible is telling us about what happened with Jesus. I think there's a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, the amount of people that witnessed it. Was it 2 women? Was it 1 woman? Was it 3 women and an angel?
Right. Do you want me to answer that one real quick then?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so, and this is a thing that's common in history quite often from it, and that's why I want to recommend one thing for you. Have you ever heard of inspiring philosophy?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Yeah, I have my agreements and disagreements with him.
Right. Have you ever took a look at his reliability of the New Testament series that he did?
I haven't, to be fair. No.
I would recommend giving it a look because while I was during my time looking in New Testament, while that was a thing for me, and then of course I devolved into looking into the Old Testament studies, is the issue that he managed to make a series that is honestly one of the best, that addresses these things. He addresses, how do we know who wrote who, the certain places that are mentioned. He even has a section called Answering Objections, like, authors were biased, the authors were illiterate, contained miracles, and then sort of the one that you mentioned is the issue of containing the sort of different narratives. And here's the one thing I do want to point out is that if we were to take the event about the city in Rome, that, we have the city in Rome that had burnt down, and there's at least 3 different writers who write the event that happens, and no one doesn't deny that it happened. But like in Suetonius's work, it says that Nero openly sent men to burn the city of Rome. But in Dio Cassius's history, it said Nero secretly sent men in secret and in private to go burn the city of Rome in stealth style. And then in Tacitus's Annals of History, it says Nero probably wasn't even behind it or involved whatsoever at all. And the Roman history by Dio Cassius, it says that Nero watched the city burn from his palace rooftops. In Suetonius's work, it says Nero watched the city burn from the tower of the Messenians, or however you pronounce it. And then the Tacitus work says that Nero was miles away in Antium, so couldn't have been able to really see this particular thing. And so you have 3 particular events that are writing down something involving Nero, and they contradict each other to some degree, but much
you don't
like
deny the fire burning.
Right, exactly, or that the city burned, or even the possibility, if we want to then just go down to narrow it between Suetonius and Cassius, that Nero was involved because, did he openly send the men to burn the city of Rome, or did he secretly do it? These are 2 conflicting accounts.
Right.
And so what I would say is that this is something that is common in history, and that what we should do is do this. And let's take that instance with the women.
Right.
We know that they're all women, and that at least whenever there's more of them in the different narratives, the ones that were in the lesser ones, like, Mary and all that, were always still there. So as one pointed out, it could be, the ones that has the most in that particular gospel, or it could even be more than that. But we know that so far each particular author of the gospel had a reason for only mentioning that particular one, and plus are trying to recollect it from eyewitness based memory and testimony of who all was there for that specific purpose.
Right, but here's the thing. I should have probably mentioned this, but my particular issue is, as far as I remember, right, I'll get to the core issue of it. One of the arguments when it comes to minimal facts theory, or I suppose an explanation, is that they say that since we have to address whether the authors made up the story, right, and so with minimal facts we determine how it's basically a kind of argument what do you call it, ad reductio, you go from you reduce the possibilities to what is the only possible explanation, right? And so they would say that, since my issue is here, right, I hear this idea that the testimony of women was not accepted, right, in the Jewish tradition, right? And so what the proponents of these arguments say is that, well, most of these narrations say that there were women, even though I think there's one narration that doesn't say there were any women at all, but I'll have to check that again. To be fair, I don't want to make up stuff.
All of them I've seen have always mentioned that they were women.
Women, yeah, sure, fair enough. Let's go with that. So my issue particularly is not really with the amount of the women. It's simply the idea that female testimony was not accepted by the Jews, and I find, and so they say basically, well, had it been the case that they made up the story, they wouldn't have mentioned women, right? Because if they did, it kind of beats the point, because then nobody trusts the women, right? Because their testimony is not
embarrassment.
Right, but here's criteria of embarrassment, exactly. But my issue is here, right? 2 things. First of all, I've done some research, and actually it's not the case that the testimony of women was not accepted. The testimony of women was not accepted in high courts, right? That was the case of the Torah. Right?
And Josephus likewise mentions the same thing.
Right. But okay, so my problem there is their testimony does not have to do with the high court. The testimony is simply of an event in nature, right? Something that happened, which is, a tomb being uplifted. Them saying it to other men is basically something that they can accept, right? They don't have to go to a court to witness to that. They can just go to, a bunch of people in the village and say, "Yo, we saw the tomb move itself," and then take people to Jesus, and so make them see it, right? According to that story, but
Right.
then that doesn't have any, that doesn't hold the weight of the criteria of embarrassment, because there's nothing embarrassing about that there, because their witness testimony is accepted within the common people. It doesn't have to be accepted by the court, right? And as far as I know, the story doesn't say that they went to a court, right? Did they?
Right. But the issue is not just, it doesn't have to simply just be a court, because even like in Josephus's Antiquities, book 4, chapter 8, section 15, and it's not necessarily being the issue of a particular court case within regards to that. You also have the fact that he's simply saying that let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of levity and boldness of sex. And then, of course, from what I just found out as well, in terms of this one book I've been reading on women, should women be pastors in the church? One of the things that it mentions was the women learning in silence passage is a revolutionary concept, because apparently in the traditional Jewish thing, women weren't allowed to go into the synagogue to learn about the Torah. They would just have to be expected to learn that from the men whenever they
Right.
returned back from the sessions, and therefore women were not even allowed to be learning all this kind of stuff, because even especially when you ask questions, that would be considered sort of you question God or you question his authority or something like that kind of thing. And that was the culture at that time, how they would have come across and viewed something like that. And so I do think that indeed, from how Josephus goes about this and just the culture in general, how they did view women was indeed, they did have a very low view on women than what we would normally see as these days. But at the time, it was starting to become very more revolutionary, where women not only were able to start learning more and actually participate in these learning sessions, but also that they could their very account, because it was the women that discovered Jesus's missing body, and thus the news of what would be the resurrection. Their admittance and their sentence was then accepted as true by other Jews who would have been familiar with these particular customs and could have just easily as dismissed it. But yet, one of the people that started believing were Jewish people, and some most earlier converts to Christianity during this period were Jews. So they would have been very familiar and had to have fit with these customs, but yet saw this as true regardless of their particular cultural customs that they were used to.
Mm-hmm. Right. I see. Well, here's the thing. I mean, the whole issue is particularly about witness testimony itself, right? And I do think there's a slight difference between this case of witness testimony of seeing a miracle, right, and then going to a villager, for example. I don't know how the narrative exactly goes in the Bible. How did they? You can teach me there.
Mm-hmm.
How did they notify the men that this happened? What happens?
How did they know to find him at the temple or the tomb?
So basically, what happens after they discovered that, according to this narrative, that Jesus rose from the dead? What did they do after that?
Well, they ended up running and fleeing, and they, of course, ended up telling the disciples about this particular thing.
Right. And are the disciples considered to be scholars of the Jews?
Not necessarily scholars, because they are mostly lay people. At that point, some of them, a good bit of them, were fishermen, because that was their craft at the time. But they were Jews that at least would participate in, the synagogue practices and all that.
Right. Okay. Would you agree then that, for example, when a lay person, right, a simple lay person, hears news of something miraculous happening, and they're told by somebody who was a familiar person, right? I assume that the disciples probably knew of these women.
Right.
Right. They did knew of them, right?
Yeah, they did.
Or is it the case? Yeah, because as far as I think Mary was one of them, Magdalene, right?
Yeah.
I would assume that they would have a level of trust, right, that they wouldn't have a reason to reject what they're saying, right? Especially since these are closer circles of laymen, right? So if a sudden announcement of something miraculous happening came from them, I don't think there's any reason for us to think that the disciples' immediate reaction would be like, "Oh no, I'm not going to believe you. You're a woman."
Well, actually,
Right?
funny enough, they actually did. In Luke 24, verse 11, it says,
Hmm.
"And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not." And that's how it starts.
That's very interesting, actually.
So in that particular narrative from Luke, and this is why Luke is interesting, is because
So this would relate to, yeah. Okay, fair enough.
and what's interesting is that Luke, with his particular way of writing it, is that he is
And then it says Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb.
right. He would have, I guess, tried to check for what, if they were saying anything that would be considered true, but the majority of them did have doubts, and Peter, I guess, is like, because I don't think he really says why Peter would eventually then get up and start going, but he's like, I'll just see regardless and see what they're talking about is true or not. But if they made up their mind and said that they didn't believe them.
Here's two interesting things here, right? So first of all, it gives you a reason as to why they didn't believe the women. It doesn't really say because they were women. It says because their words seemed to them like nonsense.
Right.
Right. In other words, they couldn't believe a miracle happening. Right.
But considering who they were,
Sorry, hello.
But considering who they were and the context of the time, because Josephus
Hold
was
on,
very
you're back up. Could you repeat that? I can hear you properly now.
Hold up, let me see.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
And audience, if y'all are listening, if I'm breaking up, let me know as well in the live chat. So
is he breaking up, guys? He's breaking up for me. Hello.
All right, hello, check.
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine.
So I don't know if it's like some weird thing with the connection again. I don't know, but I mean, considering the context and considering the time period that they are at, it would seem to indicate that, and considering Josephus and what time period he was, that's when that kind of culture and context and view would be in mind. So it is very logical to conclude that that's what's going on there in verse 11.
Right. You would say that this is that their particular reason for not believing their words is because they're women, right? Not because of the content of the words themselves.
Right, it would be the context, because there are certain words that are utilized that wouldn't make sense unless we have a particular context involved.
Not because they're women, right?
Well, it would be involved in the fact that they would be women saying and testifying this particular incident or event that occurred to them.
Right. I mean, fair enough. I mean, to be honest, here's the thing. You did beat me in one section, which is whether they responded to it. But the problem here for me is, as far as I'm getting it from this verse, it's pretty explicit to me that it says, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Right? Now, are you implying that their words seem to them like nonsense because they're women?
Yes, I would say that in light of the context of who these particular people were, that they were a Jewish people, and thus would have been following that particular Jewish example.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I would argue that it's not as explicit, right? And I would also say that if you do claim that they were mostly, laymen, was Peter considered a scholar, by the way?
No, he was a fisherman, just like the others.
Right. Okay. That's very interesting. So Peter reacts immediately, pretty much, from what we can see, and the other disciples don't.
Right.
Are the other? Yeah, it is the disciples. Yeah, it does say this is to the apostles. Okay. Well, it's a bit odd to me. It's not. I don't think it's explicit enough, right? For us to conclude that, that this, that we can argue that, they accepted this despite them being women, because at the end of the day, Peter did go. Right, and so if the authors really, it gives off this vibe that there is a kind of excuse for somebody being a woman, and it's not really just like that simple that if they're women, they're not trusted. I don't think it's explicit enough. So I don't know.
All right. Well, that's understandable,
It's
and
a bit weird.
we're about to be shortly out of time here because I also not besides
Yeah,
the fact
sure.
we've been at it for about 2 hours now, and also going to for me I got to get to helping out my brother unload some stuff. He's
Yeah, man.
moving back
Yeah,
in from
of course.
Texas, but I do want to leave a few comments because I mentioned inspiring philosophy. Have you also heard of N.T. Wright?
No, I have not.
When it comes to usually when I hear about the scholars on the issue of the resurrection, I've heard that his work is pretty much considered like some of the best that's out there on the subject and to it. And then from what I've heard, there's a guy named Gary Habermas. Have you heard of Gary Habermas?
No, I have not.
He has written stuff about the historical existence and the historical case for Jesus and the resurrection. And apparently, according to an interview that was done on Capturing Christianity,
Mhm.
he is in the middle of releasing what is said to be at least a 5,000-page book defending the historical case of the resurrection of Jesus. So that should be coming out sometime soon in case you want to keep an eye out on
Right.
that work from him. But it's said to be a 5,000 page book containing new information about the resurrection of Jesus, because it's some suggested it was like compilation of his old works, but he said about 25 to 30% of it is like old stuff that he's written about already, and then the rest of it is like new stuff he's come about over the years. So
Right.
so those are some things I would at least suggest if you're still curious and looking into the issue of the resurrection. Is Inspiring Philosophy. Exegetical Apologetics actually made a interesting video called The Historical Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus. N.T. Wright, and then Gary Habermas. Those are four names with regard to that. And I'll send you to them later. But I do want to at least thank you, for coming on and having these discussions. First of all, before we do end the stream, tell me this: how do you feel? Because while you were on here, because we were going over Islam a bit, what it meant, what these things are, and then we got a little into what we could say sort of a debating, engaging
Sure. Yeah.
background. How do you feel this was?
How do I
Being
feel this was
attacked
what?
or anything like that?
Could you repeat that because you broke up there?
Dang
How
it!
do I feel that this was?
And the chat is saying that nothing's going on my end with the thing, so I don't know what's going on today.
It might be just me, man. It might be just me.
So yeah, like ultimately, I guess is how do you feel that this went in terms of it? Like, do you feel like I've been insulting and attacking you or
No,
being too
no,
hostile?
I think this was perfectly fine. You have the right to ask these questions, and as a Muslim, it is my duty to answer them. So, it's honestly been a pleasure. I mean, I learned some things.
Yeah.
I obviously have to do my reading on the Bible, and you have to do your reading on Quran and Hadith as well.
True.
Obviously, you have to do readings.
Which, by the way,
Respectful discussion. I don't think we
yeah,
insulted each other too much.
Yeah.
We disagreed, certainly, but
Mhm.
with respect, humanly.
And while
So-
we have our people like like I'm assuming you're familiar with like the Rob Christian and the Christian Prince and all these other kinds of people. Here's a question I want to ask before we end it. Do you feel like there's any Muslims that would be considered to be on that same kind of level that people should kind of really avoid?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, there's some stuff in like lower dawah groups. Some stuff in Speaker's Corner is very toxic. There's toxic attitudes towards Christians being underestimated, called idiots and this and that, because people want to oversimplify the idea of the Trinity. Obviously, I do think the Trinity can be criticized easily, and I don't mean to use this as some kind of offensive attack. I'm just saying This is my stance. However, even though it is, in my opinion, easily criticizable, I don't think it's something that you can just, throw off by saying, "Oh, 1 + 1 + 1 is 1." Christians, ha ha ha. That's just toxic, and that's not how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, argued against Christians. He used dialectics. He spoke with their own language, and he showed them respect when it comes to debates. And honestly, we should just learn to be, just brave people and to not insult each other. And there's definitely Muslims and that do the same thing as Christian Prince. Not as much, to be honest. I don't think there's anybody out there making Patreon money from criticizing Christianity, right? And this is not to play some kind of victim game. It's just the reality of the situation right now. The Muslim world is kind of under the attack of media and just by the side of pretty much everyone at the moment. But obviously that doesn't say we're truthful or something per se. That would be a logical fallacy of like pleading to being oppressed or whatever. But yeah, there's toxic Muslims out there, and there's toxic Christians out there, and we need to avoid these people because I don't think God wants us to be toxic, right, to each other. Love your fellow human as you would love yourself. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your body, with all your spirit.
Well, there you go. All right, so thank you all for tuning in. Going to be ending the live stream, but hey, if y'all and I'll be sure to link his channel once I get the opportunity, so that way if y'all want to go check out some of his stuff, feel free to do so. But yeah, like I just started and I didn't get a chance to type out and all these links and everything, but I will certainly do so once this live stream is over. But Emin, thanks for coming on, and for all of you.
Thank you for having me, bro. It was a pleasure. Not gonna lie, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. No problem, man. And for all of you that are watching, thank you for tuning in, and hope to see y'all Thursday for another episode of Theological Discussion, and hopefully Abe will be able to join us at that point. But until then, this has been RC Apologist. Take care.